I walked into her law firm and felt every pair of eyes sharpen like knives. The whispers started before I even reached the center of the room. The loser husband is here. It was not just a taunt, it was a verdict, pronounced in public, loud enough to sting and linger. The laughter, the pointing, the subtle smirks of associates who had barely known me, all pressed against my chest. I could feel the room tilting, the air thick with judgment. And then I saw her, my wife, smiling, holding a champagne glass like a trophy, radiant, untouchable. But her eyes were cold, precise, as if the entire spectacle had been planned down to my heartbeat. She handed me an envelope. Her nails tapped against it, deliberate, sharp. "The first job of my firm," she said, "is our divorce." I stared at her, shock and disbelief warring with the heat of anger rising in my chest. Every instinct screamed for confrontation, for argument, for a visible show of outrage. And yet I did none of that. I signed the papers. Quietly. Deliberately. Every eye in that room watched as I took the first step of a journey I had already decided to command on my own terms. Walking out, the corridor felt impossibly long, the echo of my steps mixing with distant laughter. Betrayal. Humiliation. Disbelief. They thought this was victory. They had no idea what was coming. In the car, I exhaled, fingers gripping the steering wheel, mind racing. The $20 million I had invested in her venture, a symbol of trust, belief, partnership, was gone. Transferred silently, invisibly. A quiet strike, a calculated move, far from the public theater she had staged. The phone vibrated, 31 missed calls. Each name a ripple of anticipation, of consequence. Friends, colleagues, opportunists, witnesses, they wanted a reaction, a crumble, a display. I ignored them all. Control was mine now, each call a decision to be made on my timing, on my terms. I thought about the years I had poured into this marriage, the compromises I had made, the nights spent working double shifts, sacrificing for a future we both envisioned. And here it was, stripped from me in a moment of calculated spectacle. Yet, strangely, I didn't feel crushed. I felt awake. I felt clear. The humiliation was raw, yes, but it was also the mirror I needed, the moment that demanded I reclaim myself and my life. Sitting in that car, I let the memories wash over me, the small betrayals, the quiet dismissals, the moments where my voice was drowned in her ambition. It all built a fire, not of vengeance, but of purpose. I realized then that I had been playing someone else's game, one that rewarded appearances over substance, public displays over private victories. That ends now. I imagined her discovering the missing funds, her perfectly rehearsed smile cracking, the room falling silent with confusion and disbelief. I could almost see the ripple effect, the whispering, the pointing, the subtle panic as her carefully constructed world tilted just slightly, just enough for me to step into clarity. This wasn't about humiliation anymore. This was about precision, about the quiet but irreversible consequences of someone who refused to be toyed with. 31 missed calls blinked on the screen again, but I didn't touch the phone. Not yet. Each one was a reminder that I had agency, that timing was mine, that control wasn't something I had to demand, it was something I claimed. Every decision, every action, every interaction from here on would be deliberate, calculated, intentional. And as the adrenaline pulsed, sharp and steady, I realized something profound. This public humiliation, this orchestrated moment of derision, was temporary. My response, my strategy, my reclamation of control, that was permanent. That was power. And power, I knew, was quiet, invisible, and unstoppable when exercised without need for validation. I slid the envelope with the divorce papers into my briefcase, letting it feel almost weightless. The real story wasn't in the papers, or in the laughter, or in the judgment of a room full of spectators. The story was me, my choices, my foresight, my capacity to act with intelligence and integrity even when provoked. The rest, the theater of her victory, would crumble under its own weight. Starting the car, the engine thrummed beneath me, steady and alive. The city blurred past, indifferent, but I wasn't. I was aligned with my own purpose, aware of my own strength, and ready to move forward with a clarity that humiliation could never steal. I had been underestimated, misjudged. But now, everything was different. The stakes were clear, the path illuminated, and the consequences of every choice about to unfold in ways only I could control. This was the first step in a long reckoning. Not with her. Not with the world. But with myself. The person I had been, the person I had allowed myself to become, and the person I was finally choosing to be. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain just enough to feel the sharp edge of anticipation. The story was just beginning, and for the first time, I wasn't just surviving the narrative, I was writing it. This was only the beginning. I didn't answer the phone. Not immediately. 31 missed calls blinked at me, relentless and insistent, but I let them sit. Each vibration felt like a reminder of the storm I had stepped into, a storm I was determined to navigate on my terms. I needed time. I needed space. I needed clarity before I spoke, before I acted. The city outside the car window moved with its usual indifference, cars honking, lights flickering, people hurrying past, but inside, my mind was a storm of calculations, reflections, and quiet rage. I thought about the years I had invested, not just financially but emotionally, in her vision. $20 million. Not just a number, not just an investment, but a symbol of trust, of partnership, of the life I had believed in. And now, as the funds quietly left her accounts, the weight of betrayal pressed against me in a new way. Not to break me, but to sharpen me. I drove aimlessly at first, letting the city blur, letting the silence speak. In that silence, I reflected on our marriage, on the moments I had ignored, the signs I had dismissed, the sacrifices I had made while she pursued ambition without pause. And I realized something important. I had given my power away, repeatedly, without recognizing it. That ends now. The withdrawal was complete. Silent. Invisible. Effective. A quiet act of reclamation, executed without spectacle. I didn't need a reaction, a confrontation, or validation. The act itself was enough. A subtle but irreversible shift in the balance. She would notice, of course. She always notices. But the timing, the context, the control, that was mine alone. I parked near a quiet cafe, still not answering any calls, letting my mind wander. I remembered the laughter, the pointed fingers, the whispering colleagues at her firm. I remembered the cold precision in her eyes. And beneath the sting, beneath the fire of betrayal, I felt something I hadn't in months: control. The knowledge that my next steps were mine, that every move would be deliberate, that I would no longer react out of emotion, but act from strategy and clarity. I ordered a coffee I didn't even taste, my attention focused inward. Thoughts ran through my mind in rapid succession. What had led to this? Where had I compromised too much? Where had I ignored my instincts? And the answers were uncomfortable, but necessary. I had tolerated manipulation, hidden ambitions, and subtle condescension far longer than I should have. I had allowed my identity to be tied to her narrative, to her goals, to the illusion of partnership that had never been mutual. As I sat there, I began to chart a course forward. Not revenge, not in the dramatic, visible sense, but control, autonomy, rebuilding boundaries, protecting what was mine, financially and emotionally. I envisioned every conversation, every decision, every next move as deliberate, measured, and impactful. The past humiliation had shown me the cracks, but now it illuminated the way forward. A friend called, one of the first of the 31. I let it ring, watching the city move through the window. Finally, I answered, my voice calm, deliberate. I saw your messages. I'll call you back later. No anger. No apology. Just control. It was the first small act of authority over my own narrative. Driving later, I thought about the ripple effects. Her firm, her staff, the people who had witnessed my public humiliation, they were all part of the theater. But the real impact, the invisible leverage I now held, was beyond their awareness. Each dollar withdrawn, each calculated pause, each silent observation shifted the game. And the satisfaction of knowing it was done quietly, without spectacle, was immense. I reflected on my own growth. I had been humiliated, yes, but I was not broken. I was awake, alert, and finally in control of myself. I could feel the adrenaline, steady, focused, coursing through me, not as a reaction to fear, but as fuel for strategic clarity. I realized then that humiliation, though painful, could serve a purpose. It could awaken, sharpen, and direct. The quiet withdrawal was more than financial. It was symbolic. It marked a shift from reaction to action, from victim to agent, from passive to deliberate. I had reclaimed the narrative of my life, even as the world continued to misread the moment. The laughter, the whispers, the judgment, they were now background noise, irrelevant to the path I was choosing. I parked near a quiet overlook, staring at the city lights shimmering like distant stars. I allowed myself a deep breath, a moment to feel the weight lift slightly from my chest. The humiliation, the betrayal, the shock, they were still there, but tempered by awareness, by strategy, by the knowledge that the power to act was mine. And that knowledge, more than any money or status, was the most valuable currency I had ever held. I realized that control wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, invisible, unassailable. And now, for the first time in years, I had it in my hands. Every move from this point forward would be deliberate, every decision calculated, every reaction measured. I had stepped into a new version of myself, calm, strategic, unshakable. And yet, I knew this was only the beginning. The ripple effects of my actions would unfold, quietly at first, then with force. I would face conversations, confrontations, and choices that would test this newfound clarity. But I was ready. I had claimed my agency, and with it, the path ahead, though uncertain, was mine to define. I started the car and merged back into traffic, feeling a strange exhilaration. The world continued on, indifferent as always, but I had shifted. I had withdrawn what was mine, reclaimed what was owed, and, most importantly, claimed control over my own story. This quiet act of reclamation was the first step toward everything that would come next. As the city lights blurred past, I knew the storm had only begun, and that I would face it on my terms. The laughter, the whispers, the pointed fingers, they were echoes, now, of a past that no longer defined me. The future was mine to navigate, deliberate and unshaken. This was my quiet withdrawal, my calculated reclamation, my first act of control. And it was just the beginning. The city felt different that night, quieter, though the lights still pulsed like a heartbeat. I walked through my apartment, the silence pressing against me, almost comforting in its constancy. 31 missed calls had become 32, then 33 as the evening stretched on. Each ping, each notification, was a reminder that the world outside was moving, talking, judging, but I wasn't rushing to answer. I didn't need to. Not yet. I poured a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the dim light as I let it settle in the glass. I thought about her, the woman who had orchestrated public humiliation with precision, and the life we had built together, or at least the illusion of it. Every investment, every compromise, every sleepless night I had dedicated to supporting her dreams flashed through my mind. And in the quiet, I realized something unsettling. I had invested too much of myself without ever safeguarding who I was. The $20 million was gone from her firm, transferred silently, invisibly, deliberately. The thought should have brought a rush of vindication, but instead it brought a calm, almost clinical clarity. This wasn't about revenge. It was about recalibration. About understanding the dynamics that had allowed humiliation to happen and resolving not to let them repeat. I replayed the opening scene in my mind. The smirks, the whispers, the cold precision of her eyes. Each detail was a puzzle piece, each gesture a hint of the strategy one now needed to implement. I knew her patterns, her need for control, her reliance on spectacle. And I also knew my own power, the resources, the insight, the patience I had cultivated over years of building and strategizing. A knock at the door broke my train of thought. I froze, listening. Another knock. Purposeful. Insistent. I moved cautiously, opening the door to see a familiar face. An old associate of mine, someone I trusted, someone who understood the weight of this moment. "We need to talk," he said, his tone low, urgent. I stepped aside, letting him in, feeling the air shift in the apartment. This was no longer just about financial control. This was about information, strategy, alliances. The world was moving around me, and if I wasn't careful, I'd be caught off guard. But I wasn't caught off guard. Not anymore. We sat at the kitchen table, coffee in hand, voices low. I listened more than I spoke, cataloging each detail, each hint of risk, each subtle pressure that could escalate the situation. The stakes were higher now, not just money, not just humiliation, but influence, reputation, the perception of power. And I knew that every misstep now could undo months of careful calculation. I reflected on the reactions I might face tomorrow, next week, in the coming months. How she would realize the $20 million was gone, how the firm's staff would react, how gossip would swirl. I let each possibility play out in my mind, but without panic. Each scenario was a chance to prepare, to anticipate, to act deliberately. The calm before the storm was deceptive, and I welcomed it. It was a moment to breathe, to think, to strategize. Most people would panic, would act impulsively, would let emotion dictate their moves. But I was no longer most people. I had learned, painfully and publicly, what it meant to be underestimated, and I had resolved not to let that happen again. I walked to the balcony, staring at the city skyline, the lights reflecting the chaos and potential of the world outside. The storm would come, that much was certain. People would call, people would confront, people would try to manipulate or provoke. But I had time. I had clarity. I had control. And that was more valuable than any display of immediate reaction. As I sipped my coffee, I thought about the conversations that lay ahead, the ones that would test my patience, my resolve, my strategy. Every word I would speak, every decision I would make, would now be intentional. Every action would have consequence, calculated, precise. I had been reactive before. No longer. The calm wasn't peace. It was preparation. It was the space where a plan forms, where understanding deepens, where control consolidates. And as the night stretched on, I felt it, the first real sense of empowerment since the humiliation. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady, unshakable, deliberate. By the time I finally sat back, exhausted, the city had grown stiller, the lights dimmer. Yet inside, my mind raced with possibilities, strategies, contingencies. I had reclaimed a measure of control, but I knew the storm was inevitable. The question wasn't if it would hit, it was how I would navigate it. And for the first time, I felt ready. Fully present. Fully aware. This was the calm before the storm. The moment to understand, to anticipate, to prepare. The quiet before the inevitable confrontation, before the ripple effects of my actions became unavoidable. And I would meet it on my terms, deliberate, unshaken, and fully in control of the story I was now determined to write. The first light of morning cut through the blinds, sharp and unforgiving, and I realized the storm had already begun. My phone vibrated again, another round of missed calls, messages piling up like a wall I hadn't planned to scale yet. I didn't answer. Not immediately. Each notification was a reminder that the world was moving, reacting, judging, but I was still in control, still orchestrating my own response. The doorbell rang before I could even finish my coffee. I froze, the familiar twinge of tension rising in my chest. Another knock, more insistent, purposeful. I moved to the door cautiously, feeling the air thicken with anticipation. Outside stood a figure I hadn't expected, a visitor who brought news, urgency, and subtle threat. Their presence signaled that the consequences of my quiet withdrawal were beginning to ripple outward, touching not just the firm, but people I had connections with, allies and adversaries alike. "We need to talk, now," they said, voice low but urgent. I stepped aside, letting them in, watching the subtle shift in the apartment's energy as the first real confrontation of the aftermath unfolded. This was no longer abstract or theoretical. The actions I had taken had consequences, visible and immediate. The storm I had anticipated wasn't coming, it was here, knocking at my door. We sat at the kitchen table, the morning light casting harsh shadows across the room. The conversation was measured, deliberate, focused on information I needed to understand the scope of what had been set in motion. Every detail mattered, every nuance was a potential catalyst. I listened more than I spoke, cataloging each risk, each pressure point, each opportunity. This escalation was complex, multifaceted, and demanded calm precision. Meanwhile, her reaction was inevitable. I knew it would come, and when it did, the people around her, the colleagues, the staff, the whisperers, would sense a fracture in her carefully maintained poise. I imagined the moment she realized the $20 million was gone, the subtle shift in her expression, the tightening of her jaw, the almost imperceptible panic in her eyes. And I knew that would be the first domino to fall. Despite the tension, I felt a strange sense of exhilaration. The world was finally matching the intensity of my focus. Every phone call I ignored, every calculated silence, every strategic choice amplified the impact of my presence in the unfolding narrative. Control was subtle, invisible, but undeniable. I paced the apartment, thinking through the ripple effects, the reactions of friends, of family, of colleagues, the potential fallout at the firm, the gossip and whispers that would inevitably spread. Each scenario required a mental rehearsal, a strategic assessment. I had learned the hard way that reaction without thought was surrender, that visible displays of emotion could be exploited. This time, I was deliberate, precise, and unshakable. At one point, I paused by the window, looking out at the city below. The people hurrying past, the traffic, the hum of life continuing obliviously, it all felt almost cinematic. And I realized that while the world moved in chaos, I had found order within myself. The escalation, the pressure, the looming confrontations, they didn't frighten me. They sharpened me. They demanded my best, most strategic self. And I was ready. A call finally came through from a close confidant. I answered, keeping my tone calm, deliberate. "Yes, I'm aware." "And yes, we'll handle it," I said, carefully controlling every inflection, every pause. No panic, no emotion leaking, just measured authority. The conversation ended, and I felt the weight lift slightly, not from relief, but from clarity. Each action, each word, each step was deliberate, designed to control the narrative I had once allowed others to dictate. By mid-afternoon, the signs of escalation were everywhere. Messages from her colleagues, subtle inquiries from mutual contacts, whispers from the outside world, all indicators that the quiet withdrawal had initiated a chain reaction. And I watched it unfold like a chessboard, each piece moving in predictable ways, yet influenced by my strategy, my foresight, my understanding of human behavior. The adrenaline that had been coiled tightly within me now flowed with purpose. I was no longer reacting to humiliation, no longer being pulled into the spectacle. I was orchestrating, observing, and calculating every next move. Each ripple from my actions was a reminder of the control I had claimed, the authority I had reasserted over my own life. As evening approached, I finally allowed myself a moment of reflection. The escalation had arrived, undeniable and intense, but I was not just surviving it, I was mastering it. The visitor had left, leaving behind information, insight, and the certainty that the stakes were higher than I had anticipated. Yet I felt unshaken, confident in my ability to navigate the storm on my terms. The city lights began to shimmer as dusk fell, casting long shadows that mirrored the complex web of relationships, actions, and consequences I was now entangled in. This was no longer just about money or humiliation. This was about strategy, perception, control. And I had claimed it, quietly, deliberately, irrevocably. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension ease just enough to let anticipation rise. The storm would continue. The consequences of my actions would reach far and wide. But I was ready. The escalation had begun, and I would meet it fully prepared, fully aware, and fully in control. This was no longer quiet withdrawal. This was the moment where strategy met consequence, where patience intersected with reality, and where power, silent, precise, and unassailable, became unmistakable. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that the next moves would define everything that followed. I didn't need to imagine it anymore. She was waiting, and the tension between us had reached its peak. The office smelled of polished wood and faint perfume, a carefully curated environment designed to impress, to intimate. And yet, as I stepped into the room, I felt none of that. I felt clarity, control, purpose. Her eyes met mine immediately, sharp, assessing, challenging. I could see the moment she realized, fully, that the $20 million was gone, that her public spectacle had not produced the outcome she expected. For a brief moment, I imagined her mind racing, calculating, reassessing. That pause, that tiny fissure in her composed facade, was enough. "You think this makes you the winner?" she asked, voice tight but controlled. I stood there, letting the silence speak before I responded. "I'm not playing your game anymore. I'm playing mine." The words were simple, deliberate, each syllable carrying weight, authority, and finality. We sat across from each other, the divorce papers between us like a battlefield map, outlining the terrain of our shared history, our battles, and our betrayals. The conversation began with small, pointed questions about the firm, about the money, about our life together. Each question was met with measured answers, calm reflections, and occasional internal monologues I didn't voice aloud, but felt acutely. I catalogued her reactions, her subtle shifts, her attempts to regain psychological leverage. The confrontation escalated quickly, the tension thickening like storm clouds before the first crack of lightning. Accusations and half-truths flew, but I stayed grounded. Every emotional reaction, every defensive gesture she made, I observed and processed, letting them inform my strategy. I realized that my composure was my power. Her volatility, her need to provoke, was a tool I could neutralize simply by remaining deliberate, calm, and unshakable. I spoke softly but firmly, outlining my perspective on the betrayal, the investment, and the choices that had led us here. I didn't need to be loud, didn't need to dramatize. The authority in my tone, the clarity in my reasoning, and the calm in my demeanor spoke louder than any shout could. "I gave everything I could," I said, meeting her gaze, "and now I choose to protect myself. That's not victory or defeat. That's reality." The words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning, impossible to dismiss. She tried to argue, to frame me as petty, vindictive, or emotionally reactive. But I was neither. Each word she spoke, each subtle attempt to regain leverage, was met with measured acknowledgement, reflection, and careful counterpoints. I didn't need to win the argument in her terms. I only needed to assert my presence, my autonomy, and my clarity. For the first time, we didn't just exchange words. We exchanged truths. Bitter, raw, uncomfortable truths that had been buried under years of compromise, silence, and facade. I voiced my feelings, the humiliation, the betrayal, the frustration of being underestimated and dismissed. And she voiced hers, revealing vulnerabilities I had never seen even in years of marriage. That vulnerability was fleeting, but it was real, and it changed the dynamic entirely. In that room, I realized that the confrontation was not about winning or losing. It was about acknowledgement, recognition, and the reassertion of boundaries. I had been underestimated, overlooked, and mocked. Now I was asserting myself, not through spectacle, but through clarity, calm, and presence. We reached a pause, the silence stretching between us, heavy with reflection. I looked at the papers, at the history they represented, and at her, this woman who had once been my partner, my equal, and my rival. And I knew that whatever happened next, I had claimed my agency. I had reclaimed the narrative of my life, and nothing she could say or do would take that from me. The confrontation ended not with a dramatic flourish, but with quiet understanding. We didn't embrace, we didn't reconcile. We simply acknowledged the reality. The dynamics had shifted, and the power was no longer hers alone. It was shared, understood, and finally respected. Walking out, I felt a strange sense of release. The storm of humiliation had transformed into a moment of clarity. I had faced the confrontation, maintained my composure, and reasserted my authority over my life, my choices, and my identity. The world had watched me step into the battlefield of emotion and emerge intact, deliberate, and empowered. And as I left the office, I realized this was not the end of the storm. There would be repercussions, challenges, and decisions yet to come. But I was no longer reactive. I was deliberate. I was clear. And for the first time in a long time, I felt fully, undeniably in control of the story I was living. The night after the confrontation, sleep felt impossible. My mind was alive, each thought circling, analyzing, strategizing. The confrontation had been more than a verbal sparring match. It had been a revelation, exposing not only her vulnerabilities but also my own. I realized that the turning point wasn't just about reclaiming financial control or asserting boundaries. It was about defining who I was, independent of the past, independent of her, independent of expectations. I sat at my desk, the glow of my laptop illuminating a stack of documents, emails, and financial statements. Every detail mattered now. Every number, every email, every signature was a thread in the tapestry of a larger strategy. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was architecting the next phase of my life. The storm had exposed weakness, but it had also revealed opportunity. I thought about the choices before me, the crossroads where emotion and logic intersected. Each decision I made now would echo far beyond the immediate, shaping the perception of me, my trajectory, and the consequences she would face. I allowed myself a moment to reflect, to acknowledge the fear, the anger, the betrayal, but I did not dwell. Reflection became fuel, not distraction. The phone buzzed again. Another wave of messages, missed calls, attempts to provoke a reaction. I ignored them, letting the silence build tension, letting the anticipation grow. Patience had become my weapon, deliberate restraint my advantage. I realized that real power isn't about visible victories. It's about timing, clarity, and precision. I drafted emails, outlined conversations, planned contingencies. Each scenario required thinking 3 steps ahead, anticipating reactions, and maintaining emotional control. This was the turning point, the realization that my actions now could reshape not just the immediate conflict but the trajectory of my personal and professional life. I reflected on what I had learned through humiliation and confrontation, that control could not be demanded, it had to be claimed, that influence was subtle, strategic, and invisible, that strength was quiet, deliberate, and unshakable. This insight shifted something fundamental within me. I was no longer responding to the world, I was directing it. Midnight came and went, and with it, a sense of purpose settled deep in my chest. I stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the city lights, each one a reflection of lives moving forward, oblivious to the intricacies of power, betrayal, and strategy unfolding in my world. And yet I felt aligned, in control and ready. I knew the next interactions would test every principle I had just embraced: patience, clarity, and composure. Each meeting, each conversation, each subtle negotiation would require precision. And I was prepared to execute with calm authority, to navigate the storm not as a victim, but as a strategist. As dawn broke, the turning point became undeniable. The storm had revealed more than conflict. It had revealed the capacity within me to act decisively, to reclaim authority, and to define my own path. I realized that the humiliation, the withdrawal, the confrontation, they were all part of a process, a series of steps that had sharpened me, clarified my vision, and prepared me for what lay ahead. I took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline settle into a steady rhythm of focus and determination. The choices I made now, the actions I took, would ripple forward, shaping outcomes beyond my immediate perception. I felt a calm certainty that I had never known before, the understanding that control, clarity, and deliberate action were more potent than any public display, any outburst, any spectacle. This was the turning point, not a moment of visible triumph, but a shift in identity, strategy, and perspective. I had crossed from reaction into mastery, from chaos into order, from doubt into unwavering clarity. The path forward was mine to define, and I knew, with an unshakable certainty, that I was ready to face whatever came next with deliberate intent and calculated authority. The storm was far from over, but I had found my center, my strategy, my power. And from this turning point, everything else would follow. The day arrived like a storm on the horizon, heavy and undeniable. I walked into the room, the air thick with tension and expectation. Every step I took felt deliberate, measured, as if the world itself was holding its breath. This was the moment where all the small maneuvers, the patient strategies, the quiet withdrawals, and the controlled confrontations would converge. This was the climax, the point of reckoning where decisions became irreversible. She was already there, poised, confident, though I could see the subtle cracks in her facade. The room, perfectly arranged, with its polished surfaces and orchestrated lighting, was designed to impress, to intimidate. But I saw past it. I saw her, and I saw the stakes, and I felt neither fear nor hesitation. This time, I was the one with clarity, with purpose, with control. "I see you're here," she said, voice tight, a mask of confidence barely concealing tension. "I hope you understand the implications of what you've done." I met her gaze steadily. "I understand them perfectly. And I also understand mine." The words carried weight, calm authority, and finality. I wasn't arguing. I wasn't defending. I was asserting presence and ownership of my own narrative. The discussion that followed was charged, intense, a collision of past grievances and present strategy. Accusations were laid bare, truths unspoken for years emerged, and the air vibrated with the emotional energy of what had been suppressed. I spoke deliberately, acknowledging the betrayal, the humiliation, and the manipulations, but always with measured composure. I refused to be reactive. Every word, every pause, every response was calculated, precise, unshakable. She tried to regain the upper hand, to provoke, to manipulate, but I remained anchored. I had learned that control wasn't loud or flashy. It was deliberate, invisible, and unwavering. The power she thought she wielded through spectacle was no longer effective. I had shifted the balance. As the conversation reached its peak, the stakes felt almost tangible, pressing against us like the weight of the world. Every word, every gesture, every subtle emotional nuance mattered. I could sense the subtle panic, the recalculations, the fleeting moments where her confidence faltered. And I remained steady, unshaken, fully present in the culmination of everything I had prepared for. At one point, I allowed a quiet moment, a pause so deliberate it spoke volumes. The silence carried the acknowledgement of truths too long ignored, of power too long underestimated. In that pause, I realized the climax was not just about victory over her. It was about victory over doubt, fear, and hesitation within myself. The confrontation had become a mirror, reflecting not only her actions but my own growth and resilience. Finally, the discussion drew to a close. No dramatic resolution, no public declaration. Just understanding, recognition, boundaries firmly established and acknowledged. I had faced the culmination of humiliation, withdrawal, confrontation, and strategy, and I had emerged intact, deliberate, and in control. Walking away, I felt a surge of empowerment unlike any I had experienced before. The storm had reached its peak, and I had not just weathered it, I had mastered it. Every calculated move, every measured pause, every deliberate act of restraint had led to this moment of clarity and control. I was no longer defined by her actions, by the judgment of others, or by past compromises. I was defined by my choices, my strategy, my unwavering presence. The world outside continued its rhythm, indifferent to the intensity of the battle I had just navigated. But I didn't need their recognition. I had reclaimed my narrative, asserted my autonomy, and embraced my power. The climax had been reached, and I had emerged with dignity, clarity, and an unshakable sense of self. This was the point where the storm met resolution, where preparation, strategy, and patience converged into action and consequence. And as I stepped into the evening, I knew that while challenges remained, I had mastered the pivotal moment that defined everything that followed. The day was quiet, deceptively so, like the world itself was holding its breath after the storm. I sat at my desk, reviewing the final details, the last calculations, the The consequences that had been set in motion weeks ago but had now settled into clarity. The tension that had gripped me for so long had finally eased, replaced by a calm awareness. The battle had ended, and I had emerged not only unbroken, but stronger. The divorce papers, once a symbol of humiliation, lay quietly in my briefcase, inert, their power neutralized by my acceptance and control. The $20 million had been reclaimed strategically, a quiet assertion of agency that needed no fanfare. The public spectacle, the whispers, the judgment, they no longer mattered. I had reclaimed not just finances, but identity, dignity, and vision. I thought about her, my wife, my former partner in both life and ambition. The confrontations had been intense, but they revealed something crucial: boundaries, clarity, and mutual acknowledgement of power. We hadn't reconciled, nor did we need to. Recognition had been enough. Understanding, silent and firm, was the currency of the resolution. The phone, once a source of chaos, now rang only occasionally, muted, manageable. I answered when necessary, deliberate in every word, every pause, every inflection. My control over communication mirrored my control over my life, my narrative, my strategy. I had learned to separate emotion from action, presence from performance, and clarity from reaction. Walking through the city later, I felt the air differently. The lights, the noise, the people, they seemed less imposing, less judgmental. They were simply part of a world I now navigated with purpose and intent. Every step I took, every decision I made, was deliberate, informed by experience, and tempered by the lessons of the storm I had endured. I reflected on the transformation, the journey from public humiliation to quiet withdrawal, strategic observation, confrontation, and ultimately, resolution. I had faced betrayal, manipulation, and doubt. I had encountered the worst of human ambition, the sharp edges of pride and spectacle. And yet, through it all, I had discovered something far more valuable: myself. The calm was different now. It wasn't passive. It was active, intentional, a state of being where clarity, agency, and confidence coexisted. The lessons of the past, the struggles of the present, and the strategies employed in the climax had fused into a new identity, deliberate, unshakable, and empowered. I allowed myself a moment of reflection, letting the realizations sink in. Humiliation had been painful, yes. Betrayal had been raw. Confrontation had been intense. But each moment had served a purpose, each challenge had honed resilience, and each choice had fortified agency. The resolution was not just legal or financial, it was profoundly personal. I looked at the skyline, the city lights shimmering like distant stars, and I felt something I hadn't in years: unshakable clarity. The story that had once seemed dictated by others was now authored by me. Every move, every decision, every pause had been deliberate. Every consequence, every ripple, had been anticipated and managed. I was the author of my own narrative. The day faded into evening, and I felt the last vestiges of tension ease completely. The storm had passed, the climax had been met, and the resolution had been achieved. I had reclaimed control over my finances, my identity, and my narrative. I had emerged with dignity, insight, and empowerment. This was the end of the journey, not as a culmination of victory over another, but as a triumph of clarity, deliberate action, and self-reclamation. I had faced humiliation, confrontation, and the unpredictable tides of human ambition, and I had emerged intact, stronger, and fully in command of my life. I exhaled, letting the city breathe with me. The lessons were internalized, the growth was real, and the path ahead, though still filled with choices, was mine to define. This was the resolution, calm, deliberate, and empowering. The storm had passed, and I was ready for whatever came next, fully confident in my agency, my clarity, and my power.